Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to go deep on what makes you you. And no, I'm not talking about like your favorite pizza toppings or anything like that. We're talking about the very essence of human nature. And we've got a fascinating guide for this journey of self-discovery, small places, large issues. It's a foundational text in anthropology, and we're going to be pulling out some key insights to uncover how much of who we are is shaped by the often invisible hand of culture. So buckle up, because this deep dive might just make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. Now, we often hear we're products of our genes, right? Like our biology is our destiny. But what if I told you this book argues that so much of what makes you you, your habits, beliefs, even how you react to certain foods, is really more a product of your culture than anything else? It's a fascinating argument, right? And to really illustrate this point, the book dives into some pretty captivating stories of feral children. These are the rare and often debated cases of children raised in isolation, separated from human contact. And it makes you think, right, I mean, language, which feels like such a basic human capacity, requires exposure and interaction to even develop. Without it, forming words, understanding grammar, it remains out of reach. And as Small Places, Large Issues points out, it's not just language. Everything from basic etiquette, like using utensils, to complex emotions like shame, they're all shaped by the cultural norms we're raised with. But here's where it gets really interesting, like mind-blowing even. The book even goes on to tackle the very concept of race, pointing out that only a tiny fraction, like a mere 0.012% of our genetic makeup, accounts for what we call racial differences. That's less than 0.2%. It's crazy, right? To put it in perspective, the book quotes geneticist Richard Lewontin, who famously said, "There are more genetic differences between two frogs in a pond than between any two humans." That means those superficial traits we often use to categorize and, let's be honest, often divide us, are actually tiny, tiny blips in our genetic code. So if our biology isn't drawing these dividing lines, what is? That's where culture comes in. It's the invisible force that shapes our perceptions, values, and behaviors in ways we often don't even realize. And that's what we're going to explore next in our deep dive into Small Places, Large Issues. Ready to have your mind blown even further? Because in this next part, Small Places, Large Issues dives into how culture shapes even those things we consider like totally natural or instinctive about ourselves. Seriously, the book even goes as far as to say one culture's delicacy is another's abomination. Like what? But it's true. Like things we consider naturally delicious or disgusting, it's all learned. Take food, for example, what we find appetizing, how we prepare our meals, even how we eat. It's all a product of our cultural upbringing. Think about it, right? Some cultures, they swear by spicy food. Others can't get enough of those fermented flavors. And still others practically treat cheese like it's like dangerous or something. It's wild. It really highlights how these seemingly innate preferences are actually like totally learned behaviors, you know?
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how quickly those norms can shift too. Like the book points to the rise of vegetarianism just a generation ago. It was seen as this fringe movement in a lot of places. People thought it was weird, now. Plant-based eating is mainstream. It's driven by all these different factors, ethical concerns, the environment, personal health. But it just goes to show that the cultural norms we're talking about, they're not set in stone. They're constantly evolving along with everything else.
For sure. And it's not just what we put in our bodies, it's also how we choose to present ourselves to the world. The book uses the example of hair, which I thought was interesting. Think about it, the crazy diversity of hairstyles across cultures and throughout history, from elaborate braids and headdresses to the perfectly coiffed bob. Even just the act of shaving one's head can have deep cultural significance. We take something as natural as hair growth, and then through these cultural lenses, we imbue it with meaning, status, even identity. And then on top of all that, we've got all those unspoken rules we navigate every single day, those social conventions we're swimming in. And the book talks about how everything from the language we use to the way we greet each other, even something as simple as standing in line, it's all guided by these unspoken agreements within a culture. And it's remarkable how we just pick up on these cues without even realizing it and just adapt our behavior. It's like we're all playing different parts, right? Like I'm assuming podcast host comes with a different set of expectations than, say, grocery shopper. Yeah. And it gets even more interesting when we consider how we consciously play up certain aspects of ourselves depending on the role we're in. The book refers to this as impression management. Have you ever caught yourself like acting a little differently around your boss than you do with your friends? Or maybe trying to sound extra smart when discussing a book you haven't actually finished?
Oh, all the time.
Right.
Like that example in the book about the Parisian waiter putting on that show of waiterness. It's all about playing to the role, creating an impression.
Exactly. It's like we're all just trying to put our best foot forward in the social arena.
Exactly. But it raises this fascinating question. If we're constantly shifting and adapting to all these roles, then who are we really at our core? Is there even such a thing as an authentic self beneath all these social masks? That's what we'll explore next as we keep diving into small places, large issues.
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And this is where small places, large issues really throws a wrench in those Western ideas we have about individuality. Like we tend to see the self as this independent, unique entity, right? But this book, it's like, whoa, hold on a sec. Other cultures have a completely different perspective on this whole thing.
It's so true. What really struck me was how the book explores those cultures with a more what do they call it? Sociocentric view of the self.
Yes.
So instead of putting all the emphasis on individual uniqueness in these cultures, your identity is deeply intertwined with your relationships and social roles. Like who you are is defined by how you connect to others, not just this internal compass we have in the West. They even gave this incredible example. Let me see if I can remember. It was the Melanesian concept of personhood. So basically, instead of being born whole, individuals in this culture, they're seen as gradually accumulating aspects of their culture throughout their lives. It's like they're piecing together their identity from the social fabric all around them, you know?
Wow. So it's not just that our sense of self develops in a social context. It's like it's actually built, constructed from those interactions and relationships. Yeah. That really makes you rethink this whole thing about what it means to be an individual, huh?
It really does. It begs the question, right? Could our relationships actually be more central to who we are than we even realize?
It's a lot to process. And while it's easy to get caught up in this anthropological perspective, I think it's important to remember that we all have our own inner experiences too, right? Our own unique perspectives that shape who we are. And Small Places, Large Issues acknowledges that as well. Towards the end, it talks about this idea of the public versus the private self. Even though anthropology, it loves to dissect the whole social and cultural side of things, it doesn't completely deny that we have this rich inner world of experiences and emotions that contribute to who we are.
It's a balancing act for sure, trying to find that middle ground between the influence of the world around us and that innate sense of agency, the feeling that we do have some control over our own destinies.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Small Places, Large Issues, what are some of the big takeaways we can kind of carry with us?
That's a good question. I think for me, what really stands out is just how powerful culture is in shaping even the most fundamental aspects of who we are. It affects our beliefs, our values, our very sense of self.
Absolutely.
And realizing that, it kind of changes everything, doesn't it?
Totally.
It makes you want to question all those assumptions we have about human nature, to embrace all the amazing diversity out there, and to really appreciate that shared humanity that connects us all, you know?
Well said. So, listeners, as you go about your day, here's something to think about. If who we are is so influenced by where we come from and the people around us, what does that mean for how we see ourselves and how we interact with those who are different from us? It's a big one. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of anthropology and the social construction of the self. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.